Maurya. Let me move a few windows around so I can see everyone and also the chat window. All right, so welcome everyone. So first and foremost, I often like to just start off by saying that I'm a practicing entrepreneur. Thanks for the great intro, Leo. And a lot of the tools and content that went into these books were really by way of me struggling with a lot of early stage ideas and still do to this day, but definitely many years ago. And so a lot of this were just lessons learned that I began to first blog about, and then they got refactored into a book, which is how the books came about. One of the top problems that I really focus in on, which is often fundamental, is what you're seeing kind of in the subtext on the slide, which is loving the problem, not as much as your solution. And we'll get into why that is the case. So let's kind of walk through this. And as Leo said, we'll try to leave enough time for questions. I want to kind of pique your interest with a new way of looking at problems. Actually, while we are even going through this, it would be helpful to see how many of you are familiar with the Lean Canvas. I'm going to present, at least put that on the screen and talk through the boxes. Based on the responses I get, I'll spend more time talking about the Lean Canvas or less. We don't have to spend as much time if you're all familiar with it. So just in the chat window, if you have used the Lean Canvas or are using it, just put something in there in terms of familiarity. So I like to lead off with a little puzzle to kind of ponder over. I'm guessing that most of you have consumed music at some point, maybe not all of these devices, kind of depending on where you entered the music scene. I'll date myself and say I started with cassettes. That's where I started listening to music. But the question that I really want you to think about is these were massive switches. When we think of listening to music, we went through these different ways of consuming music. What caused these changes? If you ask the inventor, if you were the inventor of the CD, you might look at certain benefits. You might quickly realize that the CD is a lossless device. It has better sound quality, and maybe that's how you position the product. Of course, we know that sound quality did go up from cassettes to CDs, but was that the real reason why people switched? And when I say massive switching, I'm talking about completely getting rid of cassettes and moving to CDs. So what really caused that? And while the sound quality went up, it went down from there. So sound quality didn't even stay up. Once we went from CDs to MP3 players or iPods, sound quality went down. As we moved to streaming, it went down even further. And so there was something else at play here. And so kind of think about what that is, and I'll kind of prompt you later on to see if you can suggest some other reasons why we might have switched across these. If you didn't start with cassettes, start wherever your music journey began. Maybe you started with CDs, or maybe you started with iPods and MP3 players. Today, you're probably using streaming, and then the question there is the same. Why did you make that switch? So the reason I asked this question is, as entrepreneurs, as innovators, we are all charged with building better products. But this is the key question: what does better really mean? The first obvious answer is better needs to be with respect to customers, but how do we really unpack that? How do we really uncover that? Over the years, we have gone through many different product development methodologies. I've kind of highlighted a few here, going back all the way to lean manufacturing, and then we had waterfall, agile. Some of you may be familiar with some of these approaches. And then it brings us to kind of present day, which is still ongoing, the lean startup principles. And a lot of these changes I want to highlight were not simply because people got tired of the old way of doing things, but rather it was in response to changing customer needs. Sometimes speed was a big factor of how we were making these changes or why we were making these changes. Sometimes it was risk mitigation. So there are kind of these different reasons why. When we move to lean startup, when people think about the lean startup, the bumper sticker that kind of, or the bumper poster, I should say, that comes to mind is this one, which is boiled down to two simple steps, which is rush to build your minimum viable product, because that's what customers are going to react to. Put that in their hands and then go around this build, measure, learn loop, which is kind of in its simplest fashion, an experiment loop. So in other words, build something quickly, put it in the hands of your customers, start to get feedback, iterate and refine from there. So logically, this all makes sense. Instead of building something really big, and I know many of you who are doing things with climate change, we're talking about longer cycle times. So when you're building something really big, the big premise here is, can you find a smaller thing to start with and put that in the hands of your customers and get feedback? The problem, of course, is that the world is different today. We are living in this new environment where, on the one hand, product development has become easier. I wouldn't say it's easy or simple by any means, but it's become easier to build more things than we weren't able to do before. Thanks to all these things, we have more access to tools and knowledge, cheaper and faster to build products. And so you're seeing startups pop up everywhere, which is a great thing. On the flip side, though, that also brings in certain challenges. When we get an idea, in the old days, the other people had the same idea, but there weren't that many. And so you probably have a few people starting on projects. Today, when we take any domain, whether it's climate, whether it's cars, whether it's, you name it, NFTs, you're going to find dozens and dozens of people, and sometimes even higher numbers of people going after the same ideas at a high level, the same customers. And that, of course, creates competition for both customers, but also for investment and resources. And so this is why speed is even more critical today than it ever was before. So while this all makes sense, the challenge here is that, statistically speaking, most first solutions hit the mark or miss the mark completely. And you can see these just by looking at startup successes and failures. Most first products are learning products. They kind of get to market, miss the mark. And then if you have a chance to iterate, pivot, do all those kinds of things, you can build the better product. But the prerequisite for that is customer feedback, customer learning. If you don't get that customer learning, if you just build a product that doesn't resonate with anyone, you get stuck in what we call the build trap. This is where we try to institute fixes. We try to guess at maybe what's wrong. We try to then go into this experiment loop and change all kinds of things. And that's where the problem arises, is that without evidence, we don't really know what to change. Do we change our value proposition? Do we change the problem we're going after? Do we change our pricing? Do we just change the copywriting? The list goes on and on and on. And sure, we can run a lot of these experiments, but remember, time is critical. Each experiment takes time. Each experiment requires data. And so while we are running all these experiments, sometimes we do get lucky and we unlock one of those insights that takes us further. But more often than not, people get stuck in this hamster wheel circle. So we're just busy running endless cycles of experiments. And as you can probably guess what I'm going to say next, it's a bit like throwing spaghetti on the wall. Sometimes you will get lucky and something will stick, but many times you're just really throwing a bunch of stuff. And so there is a better way to go around this process. So what we're going to be talking about today is not really rushing to build out a solution. And for those of you that have built a solution, there's nothing wrong. There's no like, I don't want you to get into a sunk cost fallacy kind of a mode where you have to throw it out. Whatever you built is great, but what you want to really start doing is internalize this mindset. So how can you take what you have, whether it's just an idea and it's in the early stages, or it's a product that you have started building, but put a bit of the brakes on and really start chasing problems before solutions. So that's kind of what we're going to start unpacking here. Now, and the reason that this is important is when we look at products from a customer standpoint, they really don't care as much about solutions. At the end of the day, customers really care about outcomes. They care about desired outcomes, about getting certain benefits, whatever that is, net zero, what does that mean? How does that affect or make the customers' lives better? That's ultimately what they're after. The solution is more of the how, but what gets their attention is going to be first, what's different about your product. If you were going to a new restaurant, the first thing that you ask is what's different about it. If it's just like any other restaurant you've been to, just because it's new may not be interesting. There has to be something different. So that's kind of fundamentally what gets the attention of our customers. The way to get to that attention is going narrow, understanding who it's for. So the customer segmentation, your early adopter segmentation, understanding why you're building this. So what problem or obstacle are you really addressing? So this is kind of just the basics of the lean canvas, and the number of you I see in the chat window say use it all the time. So that's great. So this is the fuller canvas. And what I was highlighting just a few seconds ago were these two boxes. Is when we look at any idea, we can logically see that if you aren't chasing the right customers and addressing problems that they are struggling with, you're going to be going against an uphill battle. You may have the best product in the world, you may have channels, you may have a patent, an unfair advantage, you may even drop the price to zero, but if it's not really something that gets people's attention and or solves a problem, it's not going very far. So that's kind of the logical way to look at this. The problem with problems, though, is that while starting with problems sounds simple, it isn't easy. The real culprit or the real challenge that we face is the moment we start even exploring a problem, the human condition is to jump to a conclusion. In other words, jump to a solution. Entrepreneurs are especially gifted at this. I call this the innovator's bias or the hammer problem. Is when you see an idea, we quickly start imagining a solution, and that's just normal. It happens to everyone. But the danger or the trap that we fall into is we start seeing everything from the eyes of our solution. In other words, when you've decided you want to build a hammer, we don't ask what problem should we go after or which customer do we go after. We really start selecting customers based on who would ideally be customers of that hammer, and we start looking for problems that the hammer can solve. And you've probably heard the old quote, when you build the hammer, everything looks like a nail. So we start retrofitting all kinds of problems to the things that we can do with our solution. So again, this is a common thing, happens to everyone, happens to me all the time. So what I want to share with you today is an antidote to that. So again, there's no right or wrong way to start. Many entrepreneurs start with solution. That's just kind of the nature of ideation. We get hit sometimes with a solution before the problem, and that's perfectly okay. But what I want to share with you is you can call it a litmus test or an innovator gift test that you can apply to your ideas and see if you're falling into the trap, and if so, you can still course correct from there. The basic premise of the innovator's gift is quite simple. New problems come from old solutions. What do I mean by that? So when you are building something innovative, sure, we want an innovative solution, something new and different, something that's never been done before, but do you really want an innovative problem? The answer should be no. If you're trying to solve a problem that your customers don't readily understand, that is inherently a challenge. So we want to start with a problem they're very familiar with. And as we'll see, the best way to actually bring familiarity of a problem is to go really deep on it and to really understand the problem with respect to what the customer is currently struggling. So if we go back to this example, maybe if anyone has some suggestions, let's just take cassettes to CDs. Why did we switch from cassettes to CDs? Any thoughts there? If it wasn't sound quality, what was it? Feel free to put in the chat window. If you want, you can unmute and shout out an answer. So convenience, yes. Cassettes, expensive. Tape. Yeah, so that was a long paragraph, but I saw ease of use, storage, price, portability, storage, time to rewind. Yeah, so if we look at storage, in the beginning, you can say storage became a better value proposition over time, but before we couldn't really record on our CDs, so that was not what you would have launched the CD with, because the recording of the CDs came later. But if you think of the pet peeve that we all struggle with, it was instant access to our songs. Sure, you may have mixtapes, and it was a godsend. We really loved our portable players and mixtapes for a while. But once you've memorized your mixtapes, then what do you do? There's no way to shuffle your songs. If you are ever trying to throw a party, you might create a mixtape, but you can't bring variety into the party. If you wanted to start bringing in take requests and play new songs, that would take a few minutes of rewinding and forwarding to get there. And so you can see that in this example here, rather than leading with a unique value proposition like better sound quality, which is arguably questionable, can people really tell the difference between a cassette and a CD? Sure, some people can, but can the majority? Probably not. But a lot of people can recognize this problem because it already exists. when you struggle with finding tracks or finding, I should say, the song to play in your analog cassette tape and you see a CD which has instant access, that is immediately recognizable. Now, I'm not saying that's the only reason. Some of the reasons you gave could have been other ways to frame the value proposition. But the key thing to take away here is that it's not with respect to something new that you do, but rather something old that someone is already struggling. So it's an old problem, an old pet peeve that people already have. So when you state it, it's readily obvious. If I kind of, in the interest of time, speed this up and get into the other switches, if we look at why did we switch from CDs to iPods and MP3 players, if you have lived through the Napster and iTunes and music store stages, you know that there was a point where we felt that buying the entire album for just a single song was a problem. Napster's solution was to use peer-to-peer file sharing and make all the songs free. That, of course, was not a very legal way to go about it. They got shut down eventually, but Apple picked the baton and launched an iPod, a very popular device. And then Steve Jobs came out a year or two later and announced the music store. So he had managed to create a deal with all the record labels where they could start collecting major songs and sell them a song at a time for just $1. And so that's a sort of business model innovation that addressed this, and that caused massive, massive switching. By this point also, CDs, if you had CDs, started to scratch. MP3 players don't scratch. CDs, if you have it in a disc player and you're running around, it skips a lot. MP3 players don't skip. So if you wanted to go on a run and you wanted to have a portable way of moving your music from device to device, MP3, even though it had inferior sound quality, had all these other advantages. And so we can take all the problems with CDs and then start stacking them and say, why is an iPod better or why is MP3 better? And those were some of the reasons why we switched. Eventually, 1,000 songs in our pocket, which is what Steve Jobs promised us, wasn't enough. We today want 40 million songs in the cloud. Why? Because there's a huge explosion in the music genres. The way we listened to music many years ago was more similar. Today, it's very dissimilar. We all have different tastes in music. And so we don't even want to own music because our tastes are even fickle. We want to sample them. We want to rent them on demand from the cloud, right? So that's kind of how that switch happened. If we take this a step further, I can say with reasonable confidence that there is going to be yet another new way. I don't know what that is because that's what makes innovation so interesting. There's going to be some new invention out there where there's going to be an even better way of getting this job of listening to music done. How that's going to happen is the question mark. But I can say with also reasonable confidence that it's going to be better than streaming. There's going to be a problem in streaming that's existing today, a pet peeve that we have today, that this other solution will come out and say we are better than streaming and so switch to us. That's how these massive switches begin to happen. So the reason I start with music is that music is fairly accessible and easy to understand. We'll try to now contextualize this with some principles and then we can take some questions. So the basic premise of the Innovator's Gift, there are 3 that we'll quickly walk through. The first one is that new problems come from old solutions, and that what that means is that there is always an old way. And this is a universal truth. And I actually want to challenge you to think of a product that had no old way, had no competition, had no existing alternative. If you are, again, familiar with the lean canvas, you'll notice there's no competitor box, but the existing alternative box is where that goes. So if you have a blank existing alternative box, basically what I'm saying is that there needs to be something in there. Oftentimes when I find startups that don't put anything in there, it's usually because they're either not thinking broadly enough or are only stuck in their category of products. So when we think of existing alternatives, we want to think of what are people currently doing today? How are they getting the problem solved? And there's always going to be some existing way or some workaround way. It may not be very optimal, that's where you come in, but there always needs to be an old way. So that's kind of the first premise. And as I said, I want you to challenge it, maybe with your own products. If you if you think there is no alternative, let's talk about it in the question area. If you do have a product anytime in history that you have encountered, and you can even go back decades or centuries if you wish, but any product that you can think of that had no old way, put it in the chat window or bring it up as a challenge question later on. The second tenet is this idea of switching. So innovation is fundamentally about causing a switch from an old way to a new way. So there's always an old way. If you're building a new product, it's fundamentally about causing a switch. And here's how that story plays out. If there's an old way, whenever a customer wants to get something done, whenever I wanted to listen to music when I was growing up, I would reach for my Sony Walkman, I would reach for my cassettes. That's my existing alternative. And it would get the job done. I would have certain, pet peeves and workarounds, but for better or worse, it was a pretty good solution. Like if you had asked me what was wrong with the CD as a customer, I would have not been able to point at the top problem that caused the CDs to come out. And that's where asking customers what the problem is sometimes not as revealing. We have to study them in a different way. What happens though is that over time, there's going to be some kind of a triggering event, something is going to change in the world. An example of a triggering event, which is very real and recent to us, is the pandemic. That's a global triggering event that affected everyone on the planet. That's an example of a triggering event. It doesn't have to be a global pandemic. There could be new inventions that come out. There could be, like the internet is an example of a triggering event. There could be other kinds of things, changes in behaviors as our society grows, that, as our generations move, the values change. The generation of today is more climate aware, for instance. That's an example of a triggering event. And that's going to lead to different kinds of values and different kinds of things that people will purchase to get the job done. So this has to happen first. When the triggering event happens, it brings with it a bunch of realizations for the customer. This is where the pet peeves, the problems that were always there, start to surface to the top. And that's what the second step is. And when this step happens, that leads the customer, in this case, to consider switching, and then they start marching up this hill, right? And eventually, if they find something, they're going to get a new product. And if they don't, they sometimes come back down the hill. But the first thing to take away here is that finding people who are trying to make some progress, who are trying to make the switch, are really your best early adopters. The other way of saying this is, if I just use climate change, trying to sell climate change to someone who hasn't yet been triggered about the importance of making that change is not your early adopter. So kind of an obvious way of stating that, but we are looking for those markers. What are people doing to kind of achieve a goal, say, of net zero? Are they doing anything? And then the obvious question is, what's broken with that current way? And then that's where you might come in. So just putting this back on the canvas. So just in the interest of closing the loop there, this is where, when you are thinking of early adopters, it is very helpful to identify one or more of these switching triggers that has changed in the world. Why is your customer an early adopter? It's sometimes not because of their age or gender or geography even. It could be those things. But the first and foremost thing that you want to try to identify is what has changed in this customer's world, which makes them kind of an above average customer. If I'm looking for an entrepreneur and I go to the supermarket, I'm probably not going to find many entrepreneurs. But if instead I go to where they might go, if I go to a meetup group talking about startups or talking about fundraising, there's a higher likelihood I'm going to find entrepreneurs. So there's a change that happened, which is they got hit with an idea, which creates that desired outcome, which might be raising funding. And then I can use that kind of logic to go find my customer. So that's kind of why this is so critical, understanding this sequence of events. The last piece over here is causing the switch. The best way to cause a switch is by breaking the old way. And I don't mean literally going and breaking the cassette, but with your marketing, with your positioning. So what you're eventually trying to do is, as the customer is searching for something better, you want to show up with your offer, with your product, and convince the customer that this is indeed better than their old way. And so this is where restating the problems, the pet peeves that they have. So imagine a demo or an ad where you're showing two people trying to run a party, one with cassettes and one with CDs. You'll kind of see the obvious difference, right? So think of a demo and how you might look at the before and after condition. The best way to cause these kinds of switch is really to anchor your solution against their existing way. And this is maybe something to take away. When people pitch their products, I often find they never name the competition. They never break the competition. They never break the old way. But that is so critical in the pitch. And some of the reasons for that is either people think they don't have any competition, which, as I said, is usually not thinking wide enough, or they don't want to tip the customer of the competition because they are scared the customer is going to compare them to the competition. But guess what? Customers are sophisticated. They're going to do that anyways. And would you rather them compare your product to your competition when you're not in the room, or when you're in the room and have some say? I'd actually want to do the latter. So that's why when we are pitching, you want to control the dialogue and you want to quickly name the most popular existing alternative and then show how it indeed is better. Here's an example. So again, I guess overlaps with many of your worlds, but Elon Musk, when he launched this car, he launched a zero emissions car. So that you can say was a very different thing, but he picked a sports car. And so what was he really trying to do there, right? He could have just put he could have just said, I built a zero emissions car, and that would have been a good enough value proposition. And the reason he kind of went down the other path, there are many reasons, but one of it was to break the old way. So he wanted to, for people who liked performance cars, who liked sports cars, which typically are not very emission friendly, he wanted to go after that market. And then there were also pricing reasons and positioning reasons. But the main reason there was, if I pick two axes, performance versus emissions, and I can position a car where it's best in both categories, that just stands out. So imagine if you are a Porsche driver or a Lamborghini driver and you love your fast cars and you see a drag race between a Tesla and one of those cars, it can outperform your car in a 0 to 60 test, and it's also the greenest car on the planet. So if you care about the planet and you care about performance cars, all of a sudden that old car is broken for you. So that's what I mean by breaking. So rather than literally breaking, think of it as positioning your car along two axes and trying to go to extremes on them. So kind of in summary, this is the way we think of the innovator's bias versus innovator's gift. The innovator's bias is you looking at the solution box and asking what might be different about it, what problems could you solve with it. The innovator's gift is recognizing that the most important box from a positioning standpoint on your canvas is actually the existing alternative box. If you can find the right existing alternative to anchor around, you can create a better value proposition, you can uncover better problems, you can find better customers, you can even price your product better, just all by understanding who you're trying to switch away from. So your product is causing that switch. All right, so with that, let's actually open up to questions, and we can of course dive deeper in any of these concepts, but let's go to questions there, Leo and Charlotte.
Cool. So look, I've got a question just to get us started. Now, Ash, you've been sharing these frameworks and teaching this to entrepreneurs for many years now. What would you say are the most common things that are stopping entrepreneurs from sort of fully embracing them, or where do things come unstuck? Because I think I've seen people see the light when you share all of this stuff, and then they go kind of back to their old way. So if you have any kind of anecdotal feedback of where it's gone wrong or typically goes wrong.
Yeah, so this is where, at the risk of getting very meta, all this old way, new way exactly applies to switching, right? You may have an old way of building products, and then these are some newer techniques. And with anything new comes anxiety, comes habits, right? Those are the reasons why we often go back to business as usual. Some of the things we talk about here, go and talk to customers, go and sell before you build, go and uncover problems. All these things are scary and uncomfortable to do, but there is a body of work that tries to systematize it and make it better. But you have to be ready to make that leap and be ready a bit to, just like that early adopter going up the hill, there has to have been something triggering you. There has to be some fire in your belly where maybe your old way hasn't worked. Maybe you've launched a product, not got as many customers as you thought. And that's a moment where you can say, I'm going to go and at least try this for a little while. So get some help, get some their books, their coaches, but get some help there and compare. So what I love about Lean and what drew me into it is that the process can very much be used on itself to test itself. So I didn't used to build product this way 10 years ago, maybe a bit longer, maybe 15 years ago, I would say. And as I began to practice some of these principles, I didn't just blindly follow them. I A/B tested them against my old way. And only when I saw it producing better results did I double down. So I encourage that really to everyone here.
Okay, we've got another question. Should climate tech entrepreneurs lower the priority of climate benefits if they don't resonate enough versus other benefits like price, design, etc.?
Yeah, so great question. I mean, this is where it always helps to have like specific products in mind to understand it. But I will answer the question generically, and if we want to get specific, I welcome that as well. But the way that we look at the value proposition, think of a fairy tale. Let's just use Cinderella for illustration. If you were the fairy godmother trying to promise a service for Cinderella, if you showed up and said, I'm going to help you live happily ever after, that's what happened at the end of the story. But that's one of those very aspirational desired outcomes that is 3 levels out there. That was not really the problem Cinderella was trying to solve. I mean, maybe she'd believe you, but maybe she'd think you're a crazy person. If instead you say your immediate problem is you're trying to get this ball and you have no clothes, you wave a little magic wand and the next thing you know, that problem is solved. The reason I share that example is that as you're thinking also of the journey that you're trying to take your customers through, there is a ultimate, desired outcome, maybe zero emissions, maybe, the world in a better place. And then there are going to be some intermediate steps to get there. Part of this is discovering which value proposition resonates with which entrepreneurs, and so, with which customers. And I'd be looking for triggering events. There are going to be a series of triggering events. There have already been a series of triggering events in the climate change space, and that has led to certain early adopters taking action. So just the reason I go to this picture is look for people taking action and try to understand what their next kind of top of the hill is. And there may be 3 or 4 hills that you want to build but if you're trying to build a mountain, that can be hard for your customers to see. So you can piece that in a few smaller steps. This is the same whether it's Elon Musk trying to launch an electric car, because remember his promise was an affordable electric car for the masses, but he built that over a 10-year vision and a 3-car journey. And it's that same kind of thinking. Don't try to get to a full desired outcome at the end. You can break that into a series of steps by focusing on where people are today.
Got another question. Do you think great innovators of the past, like Edison, Ford, and Jobs, used this sort of thinking and mindset?
So I can definitely speak of Jobs, but Edison, you can see from some of his mindsets of the 9,099 experiments. I mean, his light bulb was a lot of iterations, and for him, it was a bit like throwing a bunch of concepts on the wall to see and iterate and try to figure out what's really going to work. So he was an inventor at heart, but he also managed to take his inventions and solve real customer problems. So again, he was kind of before our time. Ford, you can say kind of similar types of thinking, and I'll maybe use some counter examples. So with Ford, there's a famous misquote which almost people misinterpreted. The Henry Ford code, which is if I'd asked my customers what they wanted, they would have said faster horses, and that's usually used as an example of not listening to customers. And what I would say is that that's actually missing the point, because the customers are actually telling you that their existing alternative, which happens to be a horse, if you look at the story here, is no good. And the reason it's no good is it's not fast enough. And so if you, the entrepreneur, can go build something faster than a horse, they'd be interested in that desired outcome. And that's literally what Henry Ford did. Maybe not literally, because he could have genetically engineered horses, but he preferred to mass produce the automobile. Jobs is oftentimes used as an example of the Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory type of place, where they don't talk to anyone, they just produce these magical objects. But again, if you study, and there also have been books, there are a couple of books that have been written that talk about the Apple process, and they do a lot of research. They're actually studying a lot of user behaviors and conditions. And just to prove that to you, you can even watch Steve Jobs pitch. Look at the iPod example, look at the iPad example. When he's pitching those products, he's not pitching them in isolation, he's pitching them compared to what was there before. So the iPhone pitch is smartphone. Why is the iPhone smarter than all the other phones? Because half the screen isn't taken up by a plastic keyboard. That's it, job done. And I know it gets confusing, his last name is Job. jobs. But the same thing with the iPad. Why would you want to buy a tablet? Because it is more intimate than a laptop. That's a soundbite that he put out there. So he's comparing the iPad with laptops, and he had this post PC kind of vision, which took again a decade to put in place. But these were the steps that he started to do to launch these products. So I know it was kind of a generic question. If there's kind of more specific, I would say you can see a lot of examples of these kinds of thinking in these entrepreneurs and these innovators of the time, but I wasn't there, so I can't, of course, vouch for that entirely.
Mick, was that your hand up for a question?
Yes, just a quick question. Impact and ESG and all the things in climate tech have increased significantly as importance. Do you think there's room on the lean canvas for ESG or impact?
Sure. So the way that I know that because we use terms like revenue stream, you have to be a bit creative with how we do it. I did do, I featured a guest post on my blog many years ago, which actually shows how you can use a lean canvas to capture it. But the way that I kind of look at it is that when you are essentially selling impact, or when you are positioning your product as impact, it really is a sort of a multi-sided market. You're going to, just in the interest of, like if you use a not-for-profit as an example there, you're going to have impact potentially investors or donors, and they are really the customers that are coming in and buying some impact. And that's the derivative asset that you are delivering. And the way you deliver that impact can be different ways. You might be planting trees, you might be helping people in different parts of the world. But that's kind of how we map that. So it's really on the lean canvas, it's like a multi-sided market. You have users and customers. Your users are the people who are the beneficiaries of the impact. And then your customers are the people who are willing to invest or buy that impact from you. That's kind of how I like to simplify the way we look at impact from a lean canvas modeling perspective. And your traction metric then is going to be impact, and that's kind of what you would really sell. If you were doing a big data play, it becomes data and insights that you might sell. But if you are doing impact, it pretty much is the impact that you are delivering. And if you aren't able to deliver enough impact, the business model kind of breaks down from there.
Got it, thanks.
Ash, I have another question for you. Look, I've seen a lot of entrepreneurs filling out canvases, and very often people go very, very broad in the customer segment. Sometimes they're afraid of sort of limiting their market or pigeonholing themselves, or they have aspirations of world domination. So do you have any tips around that, around what's the kind of the right size for the customer segment and the early adopter?
Yeah. So the first kind of thing to recognize is that even if you have world domination ambitions, when you try to initially market to everyone with a very big vision, you end up talking to no one, because it's just very broad and very specific, and you're kind of saying something which gets watered down. So the counterintuitive reality there is that the narrower your value proposition, the more people you actually start attracting. If you, and I have seen this with some of my own products, I was building a product for a certain kind of creative designer, which helped them share large files. And I got other people, I got parents, I got wedding photographers saying, I have the same problem with moving large assets. Could I also use your product, right? And they would just reach out to me and ask, and we were like, sure, this can work for you too. So the point of it is that you want specificity in your messaging. So who it's for and what it does. If you can be crystal clear on there, your early adopters are visionaries like you are. They could be in different segments. They will raise their hand and come and approach you and say, maybe you'll just start using it without permission, or they'll approach you and reach out and say, can we use this in this market, and kind of help you take it there. So that's the first thing. In terms of sizing, there is the Goldilocks problem, which is if you go too narrow, you end up with a small hill and your product doesn't hit the right kind of traction. If you go too broad, then you again get watered down. So there's kind of this right balancing act in the middle. The way that you kind of want to think about that is, if you're familiar with crossing the chasm, Geoffrey Moore's Crossing the Chasm, if you're familiar with the technology of the diffusion of ideas, there's a bell curve. So you're going to see early adopters, then you're going to see your kind of early majority, and it kind of goes on from there to your mainstream. the initial goal of a startup is trying to get your early adopters. And if you actually, in the new book, Running Lean, I actually have this visual. I've used this in more of these talks. I should probably just have it handy. But if you actually look at the bell curve and the hockey stick, the inflection point of the hockey stick is actually nicely overlaps with where the early adopter ends. So the kind of the fancy way or the simple way of saying that is that your early adopter segment needs to get you as close to product market fit as possible. And the reason for that is if you are starting with too small a segment and you then want to switch from that segment to a different type of customer segment, because of the chasm that Jeffrey Moore identified, there's a lot of legwork you have to go through. You often have to build a new value proposition, new channels. You have to kind of start working on a variant of your business model all over again, which can slow you down. So all to say that if you can find an early adopter, the way you tell if it's big enough is if you can do some modeling, and we have some tools, the traction modeling, and Leo can of course fill you in on some of those details. But if you can model your idea, you want the early adopter to be roughly 16% of your addressable market, which is where those two curves kind of intersect. And I can point you to some resources. If you actually just search online for kind of the Jeffrey Moore and the S curve, you'll kind of find the visual that I'm referencing.
Awesome. Well, do we have any more questions from the floor?
Yeah, hi Ash. Sorry, I dropped in halfway through it. It's busy this morning, but just a question around value prop. It's something that we always struggle with is sort of nailing down. We think we've got so many value props. Any tips on how to sort of try and find those one or two that really matter?
Yes. So the best way is to really test them on your customers. I know that sounds, that sounds sometimes a bit scary, but if you don't get someone's attention, so if I come up with a value prop to someone who is struggling with a problem, it needs to be different. It needs to kind of get their attention. So a very simple example I give, and I use this in my workshops, is Korean barbecue tacos. So here in Austin, where I live, barbecue and tacos are very popular. If I put a banner with barbecue and tacos, people will say that's interesting, but you're just like everyone else. But if I put Korean barbecue tacos, that will get people's attention. And there's a food truck here in town many years ago. That's literally what they put on their banner. And they didn't even lead with their logo, or they didn't even lead with the name of the product of the restaurant, because what matters in the beginning is the value prop. So that's a kind of a way to test. So depending where your customers hang out, there are lots of little snippets you can put out there, whether it's Twitter, whether it's Instagram, but you can start putting in value props and see, does it even get people's attention? Do people click and follow? And there are all kinds of tests that you can run. But from a process perspective, a good value prop, as you said, there are many variants of it. What I would be doing is trying to test, does it really communicate better? And so hopefully from the talk today, one of the takeaways I wanted to leave you with is better is relative to the existing alternative. If you can in your value prop say we are better and connect the dots, so this is like a jigsaw puzzle. You start anywhere on this canvas, but when we work backwards from the value prop, you should be able to point to a problem with an existing alternative that your value prop is talking to. So remember my Cinderella example. Telling Cinderella I will help you marry a prince and live happily ever after is too many steps in the future. But her immediate problem was, I need to get to this ball. I have nothing to wear. So if you can connect it to the existing alternative, which is these ragged clothes, and say, I can give you something better than that, that's what gets the story started. That's what gets people's attention.
Thanks.
Any other questions?
Hi, Ash. I did have a question because I know customers do lie, I guess, when you ask them. And I'm thinking about in that sustainability climate tech lens, it's like, do you care about the environment? Would you buy a product that benefits the environment? Yes, of course I would. Then, the point of purchase, it's, oh, actually, I just want the cheapest one or the one that tasted the best. Or so how do we, obviously talking to our customers, but we obviously need to test that as well.
Yes. And so the reason I kind of bring this picture on is that someone who is just, how do they say, just doing the talk and not walking the talk is not your early adopter, right? So asking customers, do you like a better climate future? Like all those are leading questions where everyone is, not everyone, so people will probably go the other way, but a number of people will say yes. But in these conversations, the litmus, the golden rule is measuring what customers did in the past, not what they say they'll do in the future. So we want to find evidence of them going up this hill. And so in the interviews, this is what we are really trying to understand. So forget about your product, your value proposition for a second. Find somebody who you believe has bought something because of a climate change reason, and then just go and ask them, I noticed you bought this, lower emission product or kind of a lower waste product. What led you to that? What were you trying to achieve? And that's where you're going to really understand kind of their values and whether price, and this is what we're trying to understand, is maybe they care about the climate, but they also have a budget, right? They also need to work within a price constraint. Maybe they care about the climate. We're working with a big materials company, and a lot of their customers come to them and say, we want the greenest product out there, but it has to perform, right? We cannot compromise on performance. So that's what we're trying to understand, is that there's usually not just one axis of better. There are sometimes two, sometimes three axes. So if you can find people that are going on this journey, so what existing alternative are they picking and why? That's what we're really trying to uncover. And again, Leo he's well versed in those kind of techniques of interviewing. So I'll defer to him to go kind of deeper on that with you.
Great. Well, I don't think we have time for many more questions, but look, I've heard Ash speak a few times, and every single time it's just as awesome. He doesn't get old or boring. And again, I'll say it, that the 3rd edition of the book has just been released. I've read the book twice, not because I'm a nerd about this stuff, but because the book is really, really relevant. So the book is called Running Lean. You can find it on Amazon. It's on Kindle. He didn't even ask me to spruce this up. I legitimately think that this is a book worth reading. Out of all of the books on entrepreneurships and frameworks and methods and what have you, this one, he's sort of done like the greatest hits of how you can go about doing this. So instead of, hey, it's my method's the best and all the others are screwed, he's actually done like a curation effort for you, and he's taken like the greatest hits of all these other people out there trying to apply this stuff to his own startup. So I just wanted to thank Ash for taking the time this morning.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ash. And as with all our Climate Salad calls, we have to have a group selfie.
Sure.
I mean, we have recorded this and this will be available, but I'd love a group selfie to go on our LinkedIn, because it's such a rock star moment for us to have you, Ash, come and talk to our climate tech entrepreneurs. Thank you so much, Leo. Leo is one of our most valued mentors. We have the most positive feedback from all the sessions you give. So thank you so much, Leo. And thanks so much for bringing Ash to our humble but impactful climate tech community. So if everyone can take their, Ash, I'll ask you to stop sharing the screen, and if everyone can turn their cameras on, and we'll do, oh, I just realized I probably should wash my hair myself, and we'll do a nice group selfie. And should we do it like a hockey stick curve or, yeah?
Yeah, that works.
I don't know which way it goes. Thank you so much for your time this morning. Wonderful. I've taken that photo and I've saved it. Thank you so much, Ash. And thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in. I know this is, it was hard to sort of line up time zones. So I really appreciate your time, Ash, because I know it's the evening for you and, school drop off for some of us, but it's been brilliant.
Yeah, it's really early. So I appreciate, all of you making the time. Good to see you. And hopefully we'll cross paths sometime soon.
And if we are to get in contact with you, you've been very generous. Like, should we just comment on your LinkedIn post, or
I would say LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn, probably most active there. Twitter is probably next, but yeah, feel free to comment there. Feel free to email me, ash@leanstack.com. I'm happy to answer any immediate questions that maybe have gone unanswered. So definitely just reach out. Feel free to do that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We'll reach out on Twitter while it's still, Twitter.
While it's still Twitter, yes.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, Ash.
Bye. Thank you, Leo.